The faint, gray light filtered through the narrow windows of Ironwood State Prison, barely cutting through the heavy silence of the night. It was as if even the sun was reluctant to touch the grim reality inside. The walls, painted in dull institutional blue, seemed to absorb the sorrow, the years, and the uncertainty that clung to every corner. Leonard Len Jackson lay shackled to a steel bed, his body a mere shadow of its former self. The small bulb hanging overhead cast long shadows, accentuating the deep lines of exhaustion etched into his face. He hadn't slept properly in a week, the weight of the upcoming execution pressing down on him like a leaden blanket. In just a few hours, they would move him to the final holding cell, a sterile room with nothing but cold walls and the faint scent of antiseptic to accompany him. His life, reduced to a series of concrete walls and fleeting moments of hope, would come to an end. The execution was set, the needle waiting to silence him forever. No family, no friends, only the occasional visits from Reverend Morris, the prison chaplain, who had offered small comfort in these final days. Len's final wish, however, never wavered, his voice hoarse as he repeated it once more to the guard who stood outside his cell. "I'd like to see Eclipse before I die." Eclipse was his dog, a German shepherd he had adopted years ago, and the thought of seeing him one last time was the only thing that kept a fragile thread of hope alive. The warden, Mara Batista, appeared at his door, her posture rigid. "Jackson, final requests are subject to approval," she said in a detached tone, but there was something almost human behind her words. "Bringing a dog into a prison isn't standard protocol. We don't even know where the dog is." Len's heart sank, but his voice remained firm. "Eclipse is with Helen Griggs. She's still got him. Please, warden, let me see him." He could feel the lump in his throat grow larger, his final plea, his last tie to the world he once knew. Warden Batista paused, her gaze softening ever so slightly as she studied Len's weary face. There was something in his eyes, a mixture of desperation, hope, and the weight of a man staring death in the face, that made her question the rigid rules she had followed without question for years. Still, duty tugged at her, reminding her of protocol, of the rules that dictated her every action. "I'll see what I can do," she finally said, her voice low, tinged with sympathy. "But don't get your hopes up." Len nodded without another word, too exhausted to beg any further. His body, bound by chains, felt heavier than it had in days. The cell, once a place of cold, sterile walls, now felt like a tomb. As Batista's footsteps faded down the hallway, Len let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The world outside his cell seemed to drift further and further away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The echoes of the past 5 years, the courtroom, the trial, the hollow promises of justice, replayed over and over in his mind. He had shouted his innocence to the world, but no one had listened. The system, it seemed, had already passed its judgment. His gaze drifted to the small window, where the first rays of dawn were beginning to seep through the narrow slit. A pale wash of light spread across the concrete floor, faintly reminiscent of the mornings he had once spent walking Eclipse along the quiet streets of Redwood City. He could almost see the dog running ahead, tail wagging, so full of life. The memory was bittersweet, a reminder of everything he had lost. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the ache in his chest. "Are you ready?" The guard's voice broke through his thoughts, sharp and detached. Len stood up, his legs weak beneath him. "I'm ready," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he meant it. The guard's hand clinked the shackles around his wrists, and Len was led out of his cell and down the long, sterile hallway that led to his final holding room. The sound of his footsteps, echoing against the empty concrete walls, was the only sound in the cold silence. But through the clanging of his chains, a small flicker of hope still burned in his chest. He might get to see Eclipse again, and for that brief moment, it was enough. The truck rumbled down the desolate road, its tires kicking up small puffs of dust, as Helen's hands gripped the wheel with a mix of determination and anxiety. The world outside seemed distant, fading in a blur of muted colors, but within the confines of the vehicle, a storm of emotions raged inside her. The quiet hum of the engine was drowned out by her thoughts. The very real possibility that she could be too late. The idea that they might arrive at Ironwood Prison, only to find that Len's last wish had been denied, was a terror that twisted her insides. She didn't know if she was ready for that heartbreak. She wasn't sure how she would cope if the moment came and went, slipping through her fingers like everything else had. But she had to try. For Len. For Eclipse. In the backseat, Eclipse sat poised and alert, his large, intelligent eyes trained on the rearview mirror, as though he, too, understood the gravity of their mission. His tail wagged slowly, a signal of his unease and excitement, but there was something more in his posture. His quiet energy seemed to mirror Helen's own, a shared sense of urgency. The radio beeped with static as Helen ignored the incoming calls. The message was clear. There was no room for distractions. Time was slipping away. She reached across the seat, her fingers brushing Eclipse's fur. "We're almost there," she whispered to the dog, though the words were more for herself than for him. Eclipse responded by gently nudging her hand, as if offering the comfort he had always given her, even in the darkest moments of their lives. The distance between her and Ironwood Prison seemed endless, each passing mile stretching into the unknown. She glanced at the clock. There were only minutes left before the deadline for Len's request to be granted. Her foot pressed harder on the gas pedal, urging the truck forward, even as a heavy weight settled in her chest. Would they make it in time? Would she be able to hold on to the hope that had been fleeting for so long? And then, just as the prison's towering gates loomed on the horizon, her phone buzzed again. This time, she didn't ignore it. She reached for the device, her pulse quickening. A message. "They're letting him see Eclipse," it read. Relief washed over her in a tidal wave, but it was tempered by the overwhelming sense that nothing was certain. Not yet. She gripped the wheel, eyes fixed ahead, the prison gates growing larger. She had made it. She had brought Eclipse. But what would happen next? Would it be enough? The air inside Ironwood Prison felt colder than it had any right to be, its sterile chill seeping into Helen's bones as she stepped out of the truck. The sharp clang of the gates closing behind her echoed through the prison yard, a stark reminder of the walls that had held Len captive for so long. She swallowed hard, the knot in her throat threatening to choke her as she led Eclipse toward the entrance. Every step was a battle against the flood of emotions rising in her chest. Relief that they were here, but fear, too, that they might still be too late. The guards, ever vigilant, looked on with the same cold detachment they always did, their eyes scanning her face with practiced indifference. She didn't care. Nothing mattered except that she was this close. She had to make this happen. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the walls as she followed the guard down the endless corridor. Eclipse, normally so calm, was alert now, his senses on high. His body vibrated with a quiet energy, his eyes darting around as if trying to understand the purpose of this strange journey. The scent of antiseptic and cold concrete mingled in the air, familiar to no one but the incarcerated. It felt like a world of its own, isolated, suspended in time. They passed rows of cells, each one a silent testament to the forgotten lives within. Each door closed with a finality that made Helen's heart race faster. And then they stopped. The guard unlocked a door to a small white room, its walls bare except for the harsh light overhead. It was clinical, cold, and empty, except for one man, sitting on the edge of a small metal cot, shackled and awaiting his fate. Len. Her breath hitched in her chest as she saw him for the first time in years, his face drawn and pale, but still undeniably him. A wave of emotion hit her hard. Relief, love, sorrow, and something else. Something she didn't want to name. "Eclipse," she whispered, her voice trembling as she unlatched the leash. The German shepherd's tail wagged furiously as he bolted towards Len, his joyful barks filling the sterile room. Len, his eyes wide with disbelief, dropped to his knees, tears gathering in his eyes as he embraced his dog. The dog's tail thumped against the cold floor, his joy as overwhelming as Len's sorrow. For a brief moment, the world outside ceased to exist, and the two of them, man and dog, were all that mattered. Time slowed, each second a fragile gift, a stolen moment of peace amidst the storm of everything that had been and everything that was about to come. The room was silent, except for the soft tapping of Eclipse's paws on the cold floor and the low hum of the fluorescent lights above. Len sat there, still kneeling, his arms wrapped around his beloved German shepherd, the one piece of his former life that had somehow managed to survive the wreckage. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth of Eclipse's fur seep into his tired soul. The years of solitude, of injustice, of unanswered questions, all of it seemed to fade into the background in that fleeting moment. Here, in this small, sterile room, everything else ceased to matter. The world outside, cold, indifferent, and relentless, was miles away. Helen stood back, her heart in her throat, watching as Len and Eclipse shared their reunion. Her hands trembled at her sides, not knowing whether to reach for him or give them this final moment of peace. The years of heartache, the endless nights spent hoping, praying, fighting, everything had led to this. Yet, even in the face of this reunion, the fear gnawed at her. She had always believed in Len's innocence, but now, in the face of everything that had happened, what if it was all too late? What if this moment, this precious second, would be the last before the inevitable? Len's voice broke through her thoughts, hoarse and raw. "I missed you, boy. I missed you so much," he whispered, burying his face in Eclipse's fur. The dog licked at his face, his tail thumping against the floor in a rhythm that seemed to echo with the beating of Len's heart. Helen stepped forward, unable to stand back any longer. She knelt beside him, her hands resting on his back, trying to offer the comfort she knew he needed, but couldn't express. For a moment, nothing else mattered. The world outside the prison walls, the impending execution, the doubts, they all felt so distant. Here, in this small room, Len was free. Free to feel love, free to hold on to something real. And for this fleeting moment, Helen allowed herself to believe, even if only for a heartbeat, that everything might just be okay. The minutes stretched into an eternity as Len and Eclipse remained in their quiet corner of the sterile room. Each moment shared a bittersweet comfort. The rhythmic sound of the dog's tail thumping against the cold concrete floor was the only sound in the otherwise oppressive silence. Len's mind was a whirlwind, a tumult of confusion, hope, and exhaustion. He hadn't expected this. The warmth of Eclipse's fur beneath his fingers, the familiar scent of his dog that brought with it memories of brighter days, of long walks through the park and quiet evenings at home. Yet here he was, trapped in a nightmare of his own making. 5 years, stolen from him. 5 years behind bars for a crime he swore he didn't commit. As the seconds ticked by, his thoughts drifted to Helen. He could feel her presence even without seeing her, her silent support a constant force in the storm of his mind. She had fought for him when no one else would. She had believed in him when the whole world had turned their backs. Len couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by the weight of the love they shared, a love that had survived everything: despair, distance, even the uncertainty of his execution. The sight of her, standing just a few feet away, watching him with those tired yet hopeful eyes, was both a comfort and a torment. He wished he could promise her more than this. Suddenly, the sharp click of the door interrupted the fragile moment of peace. The guard's presence, though expected, shattered the calm. Len lifted his head, his gaze still fixed on Eclipse, who had calmed now, sensing the change. The guard's face was impassive, but Len could see the brief flicker of something, perhaps sympathy, beneath his professional exterior. "Time's up," the guard said, his voice flat, but Len noticed the way he hesitated before turning away. Helen stood, her hands trembling as she stepped closer to him. "Len," she whispered, "we'll fight this. We'll get you out." The words, though filled with promise, couldn't mask the fear in her eyes. Len felt his chest tighten as he rose to his feet, offering his wrists for the cuffs. The sound of metal clicking into place was a cruel reminder of the reality he couldn't escape. But then, with a glance at Eclipse, he whispered, "I'm coming home, buddy. I'll make sure of it." The world outside the prison walls seemed distant, irrelevant, like a memory from another life. Len was back in his holding cell, his mind racing in circles. Every inch of the room felt like a suffocating reminder of everything he'd lost. He hadn't seen the outside world in 5 years, and the air in this sterile, fluorescent-lit room had a way of trapping him in his own mind. He looked at the cracked wall in front of him, fingers gripping the cold metal of the bunk. He couldn't stop thinking about the brief moments with Eclipse, about how the dog's warm presence had grounded him, if only for a few fleeting minutes. As he lay back down, his mind kept drifting, always back to Helen. She had been his rock, even when everything else was falling apart. Her face, her unwavering support, had kept him tethered to a world that had forgotten him. What would happen now? What would life be like for him if he ever got the chance to live it? The thought of freedom seemed almost too distant, too far out of reach. He had given up on hope so many times before. Yet now, with this strange sense of something bigger happening, he felt a flicker inside him. Outside, the world carried on. The clock ticked down relentlessly. A low hum of footsteps echoed through the long hallways. Len could almost hear the ticking of the seconds as they slipped away, one by one, like his remaining time in this grim place. The door opened with a heavy creak, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Detective Delacroix. The man who had once closed the case now stood before him, an apology evident in the detective's tired eyes. Delacroix didn't speak at first. He just stood there, his presence alone enough to break the silence. "We found something," the detective said quietly, the words cutting through the haze of Len's uncertainty. "I don't know if it'll be enough, but it's something." Len's breath caught in his throat. Could this be the break he had been praying for all these years? Was this the moment that could change everything? The possibility of a future outside the prison walls? Of a life reclaimed, hovered like a fragile dream. The tension in the air was palpable as Len stood in the sterile hallway of Ironwood State Prison, the sound of his footsteps echoing against the cold concrete. Time had never felt as heavy as it did now, pressing down on him like 1,000 pounds of lead. His heart raced, not from fear, but from the flickering hope that had been ignited when the warden told him about the possible stay of execution. Was this really happening? Could he actually have another chance, a final shot at proving his innocence? He hadn't allowed himself to believe it fully, not yet. But the taste of hope, however faint, was something he hadn't experienced in years. The walls of his cell had become a cage, not just of steel, but of his own mind, filled with endless doubts and unanswered questions. Now, the door of that cage had cracked open, and there was a sliver of light seeping through. As he was led to the makeshift courtroom, Len could hear the murmur of voices, the shuffle of feet, the quiet hum of tension that seemed to permeate every corner. His eyes darted to the rows of empty seats, to the stern faces of the officials, to the unfamiliar faces of his new attorney and Detective Delacroix. He felt the weight of all those eyes on him. They didn't know him, not truly. They hadn't seen the man he was before, the one who once stood with Helen by his side, full of dreams for the future. That man felt like a ghost now, a faint memory lost in time. But the moment he stepped into the room, it was clear. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about justice, about the truth that had been buried for far too long. As the judge addressed the room, Len's breath caught in his throat. This was his last shot, his final opportunity to show the world who he really was. Not a murderer, but a man wronged. A man who had lost everything, but was finally being given a chance to regain it all. It wasn't over yet, but this was the first step. And that first step, though small, felt like the beginning of something much bigger. The minutes stretched on in agonizing silence as Len sat in the sterile courtroom, his fingers clenched around the cold metal chair. Every inch of his body felt frozen in place, trapped between fear and hope, two opposing forces waging war inside him. He could hear the shuffle of papers, the low hum of whispered conversations, the faint rustle of the courtroom air conditioning, but it all felt distant, as though he were submerged underwater, barely able to catch his breath. Then, the door to the chamber creaked open, and his heart leapt. Warden Batista entered, followed by Detective Delacroix, their presence a stark contrast to the sterile white walls of the room. The tension was thick, almost suffocating. Len could feel his pulse in his throat as the warden's gaze briefly flickered towards him. And then, without ceremony, she spoke. "Mr. Jackson, the governor has agreed to a temporary stay of your execution," Batista said, her voice low, steady, but laced with something Len couldn't quite place. A hesitation, perhaps? Or maybe something deeper, something akin to guilt. Len's mind went blank. The words didn't quite register at first. A stay? He was being given more time? The realization hit him like a freight train. His knees almost buckled, and for a moment he thought he might collapse right there in the chair. He tried to steady his breath, to collect himself. But the weight of the news was like nothing he had ever felt before. A brief flash of Helen's face crossed his mind. Her smile, her unshakable faith in him. The love that had somehow survived 5 years of torment, 5 years of being locked away in a cell. He could feel her presence with him, like a beacon in the dark. As the warden continued speaking, the words faded into a dull roar. Len was barely listening now. He had time. Time to prove his innocence. Time to fight. The thought of it was almost too much to process, too much to hold on to. But there was one thing he knew for sure. He wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in years, there was a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel, and it was real. Len's heart raced as he stood there, waiting for the final verdict to arrive. The cold air in the courtroom pressed against his skin, but nothing could dampen the fire building inside him. His hands trembled slightly, but he forced himself to stay composed, to look as though he had been preparing for this moment his entire life. He had to. For the first time in 5 years, there was a chance, a real chance, that he might walk out of this hellhole alive. Warden Batista stepped forward, her gaze piercing but not unkind. There was something else there, something like sympathy. Len felt it in the way she looked at him, like she was seeing more than just a prisoner. She was seeing a man who had been wronged, a man who deserved justice. She handed him a stack of papers, her voice barely a whisper as she said, "The governor has granted the temporary stay. There's a chance now. It's not over." For a moment, Len thought his legs might give way beneath him. His breath caught in his throat. He stood frozen, the weight of those words sinking in. It's not over. He had been ready to die, had accepted the needle, the finality of it. But now, there was a flicker of hope, and it felt like too much. His mind reeled, every emotion he had buried for years suddenly resurfacing like a flood he couldn't control. "I'm not dead yet," he whispered to himself, almost as if testing the words. The sound of footsteps broke through his thoughts, and he turned to see Helen, her face pale but filled with a quiet strength he hadn't seen in her for so long. She was there. She was still fighting for him. She always had been. With the briefest nod, Batista signaled to the guards to unlock the door. As it creaked open, Len felt a surge of emotion that he couldn't quite name. It was relief. It was fear. It was every hope he had carried for the last 5 years crashing into one overwhelming wave. And as the door swung wide, he stepped forward, not into the cold, sterile world of death, but into the unknown, where freedom and perhaps even redemption still waited.